The night of February 9th, 1709, should have been the end of the Wesley legacy before it had truly begun. As the rectory at Epworth was swallowed by an inferno, the screams of children and the roar of collapsing timber filled the midnight air. Amidst the chaos, one face appeared at a second-story window. 5-year-old Jackie, forgotten in the panic. With the stairs already a pillar of fire, a human ladder of neighbors hoisted themselves upward, plucking the boy from the ledge mere seconds before the roof crashed into the cellar. To his mother, Susanna, this was no mere stroke of luck. It was a divine intervention. She looked at her trembling son and declared him a brand plucked from the burning. From that moment, John Wesley was a man haunted by a sense of rescued purpose. He was not merely a survivor, he was a debt that had to be repaid to the Almighty. This haunting conviction would drive him to become the most influential religious figure of the 18th century, a man who would travel 250,000 miles on horseback, preach 40,000 sermons, and transform the spiritual landscape of the English-speaking world. The landscape of 18th century England was a study in stark contrasts. While the Enlightenment fueled intellectual pursuits and the Industrial Revolution began to reshape the physical world, the spiritual vitality of the nation appeared to be languishing in a state of formalistic apathy. In this crucible of cultural transition, John Wesley emerged not merely as a reformer, but as a transformative force, whose influence would eventually traverse oceans and centuries. To understand Wesley is to understand the alchemy of rigorous discipline, intellectual brilliance, and a desperate, driving hunger for spiritual certainty. Wesley's life was not a linear path of easy successes. Rather, it was a series of profound crises, intellectual, physical, and spiritual, that stripped away his reliance on outward forms of religion until only the religion of the heart remained. He was a man who lived by rule, yet his greatest legacy was the liberation of the spirit from the shackles of cold moralism. His story is one of a brand plucked from the burning, a phrase he used to describe his physical rescue from a childhood fire, but which serves as a more potent metaphor for his soul's rescue from the flames of spiritual uncertainty. As we explore his heritage and early formation, we witness the meticulous laying of a foundation that would support one of the most significant religious movements in the history of the English-speaking world. The character of John Wesley was forged within the walls of the Epworth Rectory, a household where the competing tensions of Anglican tradition and Puritan conviction created a unique spiritual ecosystem. Born in 1703 to Samuel and Susanna Wesley, John was the 15th of 19 children, a fact that necessitated a highly structured environment. Wesley's father, Samuel, provided a model of intellectual rigor and dogged persistence. An ordained priest and a scholar who spent a decade immersed in a study of the book of Job, Samuel represented the high church tradition. However, the blood of dissenters ran through the family veins. Both of John's grandfathers had been among the ministers ejected from the Church of England in 1662 for their Puritan leanings. This Puritan strain infused Wesley with a seriousness regarding personal holiness and a recognition of the individual's direct responsibility before God. If Samuel provided the intellectual and institutional framework, Susanna Wesley provided the soul. Often referred to as the mother of Methodism, Susanna was the primary architect of John's early spiritual formation. She did not merely teach her children the great truths of faith. She implemented a pedagogical system of remarkable discipline. Each child was allotted a specific hour for private spiritual consultation with her every week. This practice ensured their faith was not merely a corporate performance, but a personal interior reality. The meticulous method that would later define John's ministry was a direct inheritance from Susanna's household management. A pivotal moment in Wesley's self-perception occurred in 1709 when he was just 5 years old. The Epworth parsonage was consumed by fire, and in the chaos of the evacuation, John was momentarily forgotten. His father, believing the boy lost, fell to his knees to commend John's soul to God. The dramatic rescue, neighbors forming a human ladder to pull him from a second-story window, left an indelible mark on the family. For Susanna, this was no mere accident. It was a divine intervention. She became convinced that John had been spared for a singular, monumental purpose, calling him a brand plucked from the burning. This sense of destiny and divine debt created in Wesley a relentless drive toward holiness. He did not view his life as his own, he viewed it as a reclaimed asset of the Almighty. This foundational discipline was further refined through Wesley's formal education. At the age of 11, he entered the Charterhouse School in London, where he thrived, mastering English, Latin, and Greek. In 1720, Wesley ascended to Christ Church College, Oxford, where his intellectual capabilities were fully realized. He excelled in theology and foreign languages, eventually being elected a Fellow of Lincoln College. This period was characterized by more than just academic achievement. It was the beginning of an intense internal religious awakening. Through the influence of devotional classics, Wesley's understanding of religion began to shift from external compliance to internal purity. He was particularly struck by the concept of purity of intention, the idea that every thought, word, and action must be directed toward the glory of God. In 1725, upon his ordination as a deacon, Wesley made a radical resolution to leave no corner of his existence untouched. At this stage, however, Wesley's pursuit of God was still largely an exercise in willpower. He was attempting to climb the mountain of holiness through the sheer force of his own discipline. In 1729, John Wesley returned to Oxford University from a brief period of serving as his father's curate in Epworth. He returned not merely to fulfill his duties as a Fellow of Lincoln College, but to assume the leadership of a small, earnest band of students that his younger brother Charles had recently organized. This transition marked a significant shift from solitary devotion to a communal, rigorously disciplined pursuit of holiness that would eventually earn the group the derisive yet enduring moniker, the Holy Club. The hallmark of this group was a rigid adherence to a method of spiritual and temporal life, a lifestyle often described as living by rule. The Holy Club was a laboratory for spiritual experimentation, characterized by a level of discipline that mirrored ancient monasticism or Jesuit spirituality. Their daily existence was governed by a strict regimen designed to maximize every moment for the glory of God. They met regularly to pray and study the Greek New Testament, ensuring their faith was grounded in the original texts of the early church. At a time when many in the Church of England partook of the Eucharist only a few times a year, the Holy Club insisted on weekly participation in Holy Communion. Members practiced rigid self-denial, including fasting twice a week on Wednesdays and Fridays, following the traditions of the primitive church. Each member maintained a detailed diary recording their daily devotions, social service, and inner reflections to ensure no time was wasted and no sin went unexamined. A defining characteristic of the Oxford Methodists was their refusal to let piety remain an academic or cloistered exercise. They lived as minimally as possible, intentionally curbing their own expenses so they could redirect their resources to the poor. Their ministry was gritty and hands-on. They regularly visited the sick and those languishing in local prisons. Wesley and his companions did not just offer prayers, they provided tangible help. Starting educational classes for impoverished children and seeking to meet the physical needs of those the rest of society had largely abandoned. This integration of personal holiness and social responsibility, what Wesley would later call practical religion, was already becoming a foundational pillar. During these formative Oxford years, Wesley's theology was deeply influenced by the high church and non-juror traditions. Law's emphasis on a singular devotion to God and a purity of intention echoed the earlier influences of Thomas à Kempis and Jeremy Taylor. Wesley's goal during this period was the restoration of primitive Christianity, the perceived purity and zeal of the first century church. However, this pursuit was fraught with internal tension. While his commitment was undeniable, his theology was still primarily one of works righteousness. He was seeking to earn his standing before God through the meticulous performance of duty and the cultivation of virtue. Despite the intensity of his efforts, Wesley lacked what he would later describe as evangelical assurance. He was a man of sincere piety and disciplined morality, yet he remained a stranger to the experiential knowledge of God's grace. He confessed that at this stage he did not yet understand the doctrine of justification by faith alone. The Holy Club was a crucible of preparation. It perfected the organizational structures that would later allow Methodism to spread like wildfire. He was performing all the methods of a Christian without possessing the inner peace of a child of God. The year 1735 marked a radical departure for John Wesley, both geographically and psychologically. Seeking to escape the stifling academic confines of Oxford, Wesley accepted an invitation to serve in the newly formed colony of Georgia. Accompanied by his brother Charles, John embarked on a journey that he hoped would lead to the conversion of the Indians. Yet the primary beneficiary he had in mind was himself. In his own words, he went to America to save my own soul. The voyage across the Atlantic became the setting for a profound psychological breakdown of Wesley's self-sufficient faith. During a terrifying storm that threatened to swamp the ship, Wesley was paralyzed by an agonizing fear of death. In stark contrast, a group of German Moravians on board remained remarkably calm, singing psalms even as the sea broke over the deck. Wesley's subsequent inquiry into their peace was a watershed moment. When he met their leader, August Spangenberg, in Georgia, the Moravian posed a direct, unsettling question. Do you know Jesus Christ? Does he bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God? Wesley's hesitant, I do, was, by his own later admission, hollow. Wesley's 2-year tenure in Savannah was characterized by a rigid, uncompromising legalism that quickly alienated his parishioners. He functioned more like a medieval inquisitor than a colonial pastor. The mission ultimately collapsed under the weight of a disastrous personal relationship with a young woman named Sophia Hopke. Wesley's decision to deny her communion sparked a legal and social firestorm that forced him to flee the colony under the cover of night in late 1737. He returned to England not as a conquering missionary, but as a man utterly demoralized. Wesley sought out Peter Böhler, who diagnosed his condition as a lack of that true evangelical faith. Böhler famously advised the doubting priest to preach faith till you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. On the evening of May 24, 1738, Wesley went very unwillingly to a religious society meeting on Aldersgate Street. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine. This was not a change in Wesley's intellectual creed. It was a shift from intellectual assent to personal reliance. The servant had finally become a son. Aldersgate did not erase Wesley's previous commitments to holiness, but it reordered them. He moved from seeking a right standing through works righteousness to accepting it as a free gift. Joined by his brother Charles, who had undergone a similar experience just days prior, John Wesley was no longer a man searching for a religion. He was a man possessed by one. The rigid discipline of the Holy Club was now infused with a heartwarming power, a power that was about to break the boundaries of the established church and spill out into the streets of England. The strangely warmed heart of Aldersgate required a theater of action, and Wesley soon found it in the burgeoning revivalist fervor of the late 1730s. However, the transition from a refined Oxford academic to a populist preacher was neither immediate nor easy. It required a radical breaking of Wesley's internal high church sensibilities, a process catalyzed by his friend and fellow Holy Club member George Whitefield. In early 1739, Whitefield, who had seen massive success preaching to the colliers in Bristol, urged Wesley to join him. Wesley was initially repulsed by the idea of field preaching. His commitment to ecclesiastical order was so deep that he later admitted he should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. Yet, on April 2nd, 1739, Wesley submitted to be more vile and preached his first open-air sermon to a crowd of 3,000. This was a transformative moment in the method of Wesley's ministry. By moving outside the physical walls of the parish church, he was effectively bypassing the gatekeepers of the religious establishment. He realized that if the people would not come to the church must go to the people. This shift led to Wesley's famous declaration, "I look upon all the world as my parish." This was not merely a pithy slogan, but a radical theological and legal claim. In the Anglican system, a priest's authority was strictly confined to his assigned geographic parish. By claiming the world as his parish, Wesley was asserting a higher loyalty to the Great Commission. He saw a nation in moral decay and a church that was often indifferent. His sermons were delivered with a directness and emotional resonance that provoked visceral reactions. The success of the outdoor revivals brought immediate and often violent opposition. He was pelted with stones, threatened with clubs, and on several occasions narrowly escaped with his life. Yet, Wesley's response to persecution was a study in calm, disciplined resilience. He often won over his attackers with his quiet dignity and persuasive speech. As the number of converts grew, Wesley's superb organizational ability became his greatest asset. He understood that a revival without structure would eventually evaporate into mere emotionalism. To ensure that the work of God endured, he began to house his converts in a sophisticated network of societies and subgroups. He divided the Methodist societies into smaller units called classes. These were the primary units of Methodist life, typically consisting of about 12 people. This nested structure ensured that no individual was left to navigate their spiritual journey alone. Perhaps Wesley's most radical organizational innovation was the employment of lay preachers. Wesley began to authorize unlettered men to exhort and preach. In 1744, Wesley convened the first annual conference to bring order and doctrinal unity to the growing movement. Through these societies and conferences, Wesley was not just starting a revival, he was building a church within a church. He was demonstrating that spiritual vitality requires a method, a skeleton of discipline to support the flesh and blood of experience. By 1760, Methodism was a disciplined, mobile, and increasingly powerful force within British society. As the Methodist movement matured, Wesley turned his intellectual focus toward refining the theological distinctives that separated his people called Methodists. The reason of his theology was always driven by a singular goal, the restoration of the image of God in the human soul. This era was defined by his synthesis of grace and responsibility, culminating in his most controversial yet central teaching, Christian perfection. Wesley championed prevenient grace, the belief that God's grace is active in every human being from birth, preventing them to restore a measure of free will. Because of this grace, every person had the capacity to respond to the gospel. For Wesley, salvation was not a static decree made in eternity past, but a dynamic, lifelong process. He moved the theological conversation from the courtroom to the hospital. The apex of Wesley's teaching was Christian perfection or entire sanctification. He did not mean sinless perfection in an absolute sense, but defined it as perfection in love. Wesley argued that a Christian could reach a state where their primary motivation was pure love for God and neighbor. This was not a state of static achievement, but a dynamic maturity that required constant vigilance. The late 18th century brought political and ecclesiastical crises that forced Wesley to make decisions he had spent his life trying to avoid. The American Revolution had severed the colonies from the British Crown, leaving American Methodists without ordained clergy. Facing a spiritual emergency, Wesley fell back on his primitive church studies. He concluded that in the early church, bishops and priests were of the same order and held the same power to ordain. In a move that effectively marked the birth of Methodism as an independent denomination, Wesley took it upon himself to ordain Coke, Whatcoat, and Vasey for the work in America. In December 1784, at the Christmas Conference in Baltimore, the Methodist Episcopal Church was formally organized. Wesley provided the American movement with both a theological anchor and the flexibility to expand rapidly across the frontier. In his final decade, John Wesley became a national treasure. Despite his advanced age, his discipline remained legendary. He continued to rise at 4 a.m. and travel thousands of miles a year. One of his last acts was writing a letter of encouragement to William Wilberforce, urging the young parliamentarian to continue his glorious enterprise against the slave trade. John Wesley died on March 2, 1791, at the age of 87. His final words were a perfect summation of his life's work. The best of all is God is with us. He left behind a movement that numbered over 70,000 in Great Britain and nearly 60,000 in the United States. The brand plucked from the burning had successfully ignited a flame that would light the path for millions. What are the rules or habits in your own life that have become empty forms? Where is your parish? Is there a space where you are being called to move beyond your comfort zone? Consider the why behind your daily actions. Are you driven by a sense of duty or by that purity of intention and love that Wesley ultimately found? Subscribe to Theology today to join a community dedicated to unpacking the movements that shaped our world.